we are hopefully going to get from Job chapter 28 to Job chapter 31. I'm going to go kind of quick again, especially with chapter 28. It's a quicker one. And I'll just tell you how we're going from here on out. Job chapter 28 through 31 is Job's concluding discourse. They're technically soliloquies, and because of that, a lot of people think Job did not write these, or these are not his words. I think they are. But they're going to go through chapter 31. Chapter 32 through 37 is Elihu, the fourth friend. It comes along later. He's probably the older fella. And he's going to give four speeches, and then Job's going to respond. And then when you get to chapter 38 through 42, that's the dialogue between God and Job. So we have Job's kind of concluding talk about his innocence. Then we got Elihu's speech. Then we got God coming on. So that's how the rest of Job plays out. So if you look at Job chapter 28, the three friends, those three original friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, they had nothing else to say. But Job did. So Job is going to continue now, starting in chapter 28. And he's going to talk about, in chapter 28, pretty much God's wisdom, what he knows about God's wisdom. Again, it's more of a soliloquy. It's just him talking instead of a dialogue. Most of this has been dialogue. One of the friends talks and Job talks. And because of that, a lot of scholars say that this is not Job, that this belongs to one of the friends maybe or somebody else. But the subject matter lines up with what Job's already been saying. So I'm of the opinion that Job wrote this just as well as he did the rest of it, or at least he said it. And so wisdom, this idea of wisdom in chapter 28 seems to be a bigger deal than God's justice. That's what they've been talking about, God's justice. And they've been on this kick on how does God operate with man? How does God deal with us? And they've all been under the assumption that God deals with retribution basis. Like, if we're blessed, God blesses us, we're good. If we don't, we get cursed and we lose stuff. That's kind of the premise that it's been all along. Job now in chapter 28 is going to basically conclude this by talking about even above that, however God deals with mankind, God's wisdom is superior to that. God knows better. So that's what I always say. If you read Psalm chapter 46, especially Psalm chapter 46, to me, kind of sums up the one of the natures of God, and that is God is too wise to be wrong, and God is too good to be mistaken. His wisdom, His goodness, His knowledge, who He is, it does not let Him make mistakes. And this is kind of what Job is talking about in chapter 28. And so in this chapter, he's going to summarize his stance before God, and he's going to say, "This is where I'm at. This is my life." And so Job's going to say, "I'm not in rebellion against God. You guys, all my friends, you've been saying I've been in rebellion. I'm not in rebellion against God. That's not what this is about." He is saying in chapter 28 that I fear God, and I'm turning from evil. So I'm not in rebellion like you say I am. It's quite the opposite from that. So let's look at chapter 28, just a couple of verses of it, because we don't really have to get into a lot of this really. But look at verse 1. Surely there is a mine for silver and a place where they refine gold. Iron is taken from dust, and copper is melted from rock. Man puts an end to darkness, and to the farthest limit he searches out. The rock in gloom and deep shadow. He sinks a shaft far from habitation, forgotten by the foot. They hang and swing to and fro, far from men. The earth from it comes food, and underneath it is turned up as fire. Its rocks are the source of sapphires, and its dust contain gold. The path no bird of prey knows, nor has the falcon's eye caught sight of it. The proud beasts have not trodden it, nor has the fierce lion passed over it. He puts his hand on the flint. He overturns the mountains at the base. In other words, the earth is full of God's treasures, and because God put them there. God knows what he's doing. And so his point is, mankind have been extremely clever in exploiting the resources. Just look at all the ones he lists. He's talking about rocks and gold and silver and copper and sapphires and flint and all these things. And Job's point is, and it's kind of a point against the friends, although they're not in a discussion anymore. Job is saying, look at our history. Look at mankind's history. We have done a fantastic job of mining things. We've dug out all these treasures from the earth. We've done all these things. But Job's point is, the greatest thing to be mined is God's wisdom, and we ain't even touched that yet. We're real good at getting this other stuff. We're mining all these natural resources and all these things that we think are very valuable, but in the end, they're not really worth anything in relationship to God's wisdom. And so he's talking about really that, and that's the one thing that's not hidden in the earth. All these other things you can go and mine, but God's wisdom is not contained in the earth. It's not mined there. It's contained in the person of God. And so the key to obtaining that wisdom is orienting yourself, aligning yourself properly with God and who he is. And so Job said, we missed that. We've done a great job of getting all this stuff out of the earth. God's wisdom is far more superior than those things. That's not in the earth. That's in God. That's in the person of God. But you can't mine that in the earth. The way you get that is properly aligning yourself with who God is. And Job is saying, you guys have missed that, and you're accusing me of missing that, but I'm really not. I'm really not in rebellion like you say I am. I'm seeking God's wisdom, but I just don't know why God is not responding to me. I would enjoy talking to him, but God is not responding to me. And so he's given evidence, or he's going to start to give evidence now in chapter 29 of why he's innocent. This is what you're accusing me of. Here's why that's not true. Look at verse 28. Verse 28 is the kind of the linchpin and all this. It connects the two parts of his speech. In verse 28, and to man he said, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding. So the first part of his speech is, it's all about God's wisdom. That's the main thing. That's the number one thing we should be trying to get at. And then the second part of his speech is going to be, here's why I'm on that path. So look at verse 29. Again, this part of his soliloquy, he doesn't mention his three friends in this at all. This is purely about him, and he's given a defense for why he's in the right. Let's look at the first 6 verses. And Job again took up his discourse and said, all right, so this is his soliloquy. This is not a conversation. This is him talking. And he says, oh, that I were in months gone by, as in the days when God watched over me, when his lamp shone over my head, and by his light I walked through darkness, as I was in the prime of my days, when the friendship of God was over my tent, when the Almighty was yet with me, and my children were around me, when my steps were bathed in butter, and the rock poured out for me streams of oil. And then he's going to continue this. What do you notice about the verbs in that little pericope of scripture? You notice anything about the verb tense? They're all past. He's talking about this is the way it used to be. He said, I wish I could go back to this. And in verses 2 through 5, here's what he wants to go back to. The blessing that I had. I used to be blessed by God. In days past, years past, God blessed me. Oh, that I could go back to that. I want to go back to those days. I don't like where I'm at now. Look at verse 5. When the Almighty was still with me. He doesn't mean really that God's departed. He means that the blessings are not there like they used to be. And so Job said, I wish I could go back to that. Now look at verse 7, because it changes. His whole mood changes. When I went out to the gate of the city, when I took my seat in the square, the young men saw me and hid themselves, and the old men arose and stood. He's talking about his present situation. He said, I wish I could go back to the way it was. And now he's saying, I'm going away from, I'm looking beyond what it used to be. This is what my life used to be like. I used to be really happy. I used to have all these blessings of God, God's honor and all that. And now he's saying, but things are shifted for me. I used to have a place of honor. I used to have a place of respect. People liked me. They looked up to me. I had all these blessings of God. And now they've kind of dissipated. And again, Job's whole point is, Job, I think Job represents those of us who really believe God, really trust God, really love God. But we have a hard time figuring him out sometimes. We just don't know what he's thinking. We just don't know what he's up to. Because God operates on a whole different schedule, a whole different plan than you and I have. And if we continue to try to figure it out, it's very frustrating. Because we just don't know. Look at verse 12. Then he's going to compare himself to God. Verse 12, because I delivered the poor who cried for help, and the orphan who had no helper. The blessings of the one ready to perish came upon me, and I made the widow's heart sing for joy. I put on righteousness, and it clothed me. My justice was like a robe and a turban. I was eyes to the blind, feet to the lame. I was a father to the needy, and I investigated the case which I did not know. I broke the jaws of the wicked and snatched a prey from his teeth. Job said, this is what he's given a defense for himself. And Job said, this is how I live my life. I took care of people. I watched over them. I looked out for them. What he's doing subconsciously, but God knows what he's doing. He's comparing himself to God. And he's saying, God, unlike the way you're treating me, I never treated people like this. You're being pretty rough on me. You're pulling all this stuff, making me go through this. But I didn't do that. When I was in my heyday, I took care of folks. I watched out for them, and you're not doing that. And so and God knows what he's up to. He's trying to paint himself in this light that he's really, really good, and there's no mistakes. Look at verses 18 through 20. Here's a translation thing. And honestly, I don't really know what I think about it, to be honest with you, because I don't really guess it matters. But verse 18, then I thought I shall die in my nest. All right? If you refer to a nest, what's the image of? A bird. Then I thought I shall die in my nest, and I shall multiply my days as the sand. It's the same Hebrew word, nest and sand. It's kind of the thing. It's Hebrew word whole, and most time it's translated as sand. And I looked it up today just to be sure, and I found about 15 or 20 different Old Testament references that it translates as sand. One of the most prominent is God's promise to Abraham when God said, I'm going to make your descendants number as the sand of the sea. It's the same word. Some translators translate it phoenix, that mythical bird phoenix. Like when he's on his nest, that he's going to arise. Like I was beat down, I was destroyed, but I'm going to rise again. I'm going to come back. So it just I think it actually means sand. But just in case you read some commentaries or whatever, you may see that phoenix word stuck in there. But anyway, Job is saying this kind of to describe what he felt entitled to in his prosperity. I used to be like this. Now it's all taken away, but I'm going to come back to this. I'm going to get back to where I was. In other words, look at verse 21. To me they listened and waited. They kept silent for my counsel. After my words they did not speak again, and my speech dropped on them. They waited for me as for the rain, and opened the mouth as for the spring rain. I smiled on them when they did not believe, and the light on my face they did not cast down. I chose a way for them and sat as a chief. Then we read verse 25, the last part of verse 25. And dwelt as a king among the troops, as one who comforted the mourners. In other words, look at what Job is doing. All of his friends said, you're in rebellion against God. And so therefore God is punishing you, because that's the way God deals with us. Job continues to say, no, I don't think that's the case. I don't know why God's doing this to me, and he won't answer me. He won't talk to me. And so all these friends gave all their arguments, one right after another. They'd speak, Job would refute it. It went on 3 cycles of that. And now they're all quiet. They have nothing else to say. And so now Job takes this opportunity to say, let me tell you why I think I'm innocent. And so he starts by saying, God is great. God is so much better than we are, even though I can't understand him, and I'm having a hard time with it. And so in chapter 28, he says, God has this wisdom that you and I are not trying to get at. He's put all this valuable stuff in the earth. We dig all that out, but we don't draw close enough to God to try to dig out his wisdom. And Job said that's a problem. And so in chapter 29, he says, I'm not in rebellion. I was actually a good person. Here's the things I did. And he said, I defended these people. I did this. And now in verses 21 through 25, he said, I was also an encourager. I was also a comforter. Those that were despondent. And again, he doesn't mention his 3 friends, but this is a dig at them, because they didn't encourage him. They didn't comfort him. All he did was criticize and condemn. And so he said, when I was in my heyday, I encouraged people that were upset. I was there for them, And I'm sure he probably looked at them like, unlike you guys, I was actually a good friend. I was, that's how I was. And so he's saying I wasn't in rebellion. I was actually pursuing righteousness. I was actually trying to do right. And now God's done this to me, and I just don't know what to do. Now in chapter 30, now he's going to talk about what it's like present day. And I can kind of summarize this for you in chapter 30, because it's really 3 sections, and it's Job kind of telling us what his feelings are in 3 sections. And so if chapter 29 talks about what God gave him in the past, God gave me these blessings. I had all these blessings, because this is the kind of person I was. Now chapter 30 is what God's taken away. This is what I had. I was a good friend. I was an encourager. I did all these good things. God blessed me. I had prosperity, and I think I deserved it because of what I did. Now in chapter 30, God's taken all this away. So if you read verses 1 through 15, in verses 1 through 15, Job said, I am without respect now. I used to have respect. People looked up to me. People liked me. They cared about me. But now they don't. Look at how he describes it in verse 1. But now those younger than I mock me, whose fathers I disdained to put with the dogs of my flock. Indeed, what good was the strength of their hands to me? Vigor had perished from them. From want and famine they are gone, who gnaw the dry ground by night in waste and desolation. In other words, now he's in verses 1 through 8, really, verses 1 through 15, talks about his lack of respect. Nobody respects him. In verse 1 through 8, he's talking about good-for-nothing fathers. That's what he's talking about. And he's saying about these good-for-nothing fathers, he's saying, I put them in their place because they were good for nothing, but now they're actually doing better than me because God's took all this stuff away from me. It's a little bit of brand of hyperbole in these verses that kind of escapes Western thought. It's it's really Semitic language, Hebrew type language. But really what Job is saying is, I was, these evil people are actually doing better than me now. And again, Job is at the place where he just doesn't understand what God is doing. Look at verse 16. In verse 1 through 15, he has no respect. In verses 16 through 23, he says, I've just been disregarded. Nobody listens to me anymore. Look at verse 16. As though a wide breach they came. I'm sorry. I thought 14 was 16. Here we go. Verse 16. And now my soul is poured out within me. Days of affliction have seized me. Job's describing his soul as being poured out. I've lost everything, and now I'm just absolutely disregarded by God. God has no more use for me, and I don't know. He thinks. Look at verse 18. Verse 18 is pretty descriptive. By a great force my garment is distorted. It binds me about as the collar of my coat. What's that? That's a metaphorical picture of something. What does it describe? If somebody binds you by the collar, it's like somebody grabs you by the lapel. It's like if you're in a conversation with somebody and they're mad at you, they're upset with you, they grab you by the collar and you just kind of shake some sense. He said, I feel like that's what God's doing to me. I feel like God's just grabbed me by the lapel and he's just getting on to me for something I don't know what I did. And now all these things that I had are being pulled away, and now it's just like God has just absolutely abandoned me and disregarded me because I'm begging for him to talk to me, and he just won't even do that. God won't even come and give me an answer to any of this stuff, and it really bothers Job. Then in verse 24, this is kind of where all this leads. If you look at verse 24 in chapter 30, yet does not one in a heap of ruin stretch out his hand, or in his disaster therefore cry out for help? Have I not wept for the one whose life is hard? Was not my soul grieved for the needy? When I expected good, then evil came. When I waited for light, then darkness came. In other words, all these things that happened to him, he feels disrespected. He feels disregarded by God and abandoned. Now he's despondent. Now he's just like, I feel like I should just give up. I've been searching for light, and when I try to find light, it's darkness that hits me. When I try to find help and comfort and encouragement, it's just condemnation that hits me. I'm just ready to give up. In other words, verse 28 talks about Job's emotional state. And verse 30, if you go down to verse 30, it's going to talk about his physical condition. He says, I'm just done. I don't know what else to do. Now, chapter 31. And I will spend a little bit more time on chapter 31 because this is the end of his soliloquy. It's the end of his speech. And sometimes when we read the Bible, especially the Old Testament, we get lost a little bit because ancient Near Eastern culture, writing, philosophy is different than modern Western stuff. And so when Job's writing about things, he's referencing ancient Semitic court proceedings and judicial stuff and philosophies of God-human relationship. And it gets lost on us just a little bit. In chapter 31, this is a really common Near Eastern practice, and it is today for a little bit. But he's give a summary defense. That's what chapter 29 and 30 are about. He said, here's where I was. how I was acting, how I was living. I was living a good life. I was defending people. I was standing up for the poor. I was doing all I could to help people. And now God's doing this to me. It's like God's grabbed me by the coat and he's jerking me around. I don't know why. And I just feel absolutely abandoned to the point that I want to give up. That's his defense. I'm not the rebellious person you guys say I am. Now in chapter 31, he concludes his defense with an oath of innocence. Oaths are I think, we use the phrase, a man of your word, and it used to be that you could shake hands with somebody and that their words, their bond. They're not so much nowadays. People look you in the face, tell you one thing, and do another. It's not the way it was. Oaths in this ancient Near Eastern time period is pretty serious business. And so what's happening in chapter 31 is Job gave this. It's almost like a court proceeding, and Job is given his concluding summation of his case. This is why I'm innocent. Now he's going to conclude this with an oath. He's going to take an oath, and he's going to swear to his innocence. And once they do that, there's no coming back from it, because in Job's own words, what he's going to say is, if I'm guilty, this is what my punishment should be. And I'm trusting God's goodness and fairness that if I am guilty, God's going to judge me, and here's the way God ought to judge me, and I'm going to be okay with it. But he doesn't think he's guilty, but he's throwing himself on the mercy of the court, as it were. And so in chapter 31, here's what he's going to do. Just to kind of explain this before we get into it. He is going to give a negative confession, why he's innocent, why he didn't do these things. And then he's going to follow this with a word that you hear in the Psalms a lot. He's going to follow this with a lot of self-imprecation. You ever heard of an imprecatory psalm? It's a psalm where the psalmist is praying, basically a sick'em psalm, where the psalmist is saying, God, please go get this person, do something to them. They're evil. They deserve to be punished, kind of thing. Job is going to do a kind of a self-imprecatory statement here, where he's going to say, if I've done these things, then this ought to be my punishment. God ought to do this to me. He ought to come after me. He ought to punish me like this. This is what chapter 31 is going to be about. In other words, Job is laying out his own punishment. He still thinks he's innocent, but he relies on the wisdom of God. He said, okay, God, I think I'm innocent, but if you think I'm guilty, this is really what you should do to me. This should be my punishment, which is kind of a scary thought. And so if God remains silent, because here's the test. It's kind of like throwing out this, kind of like Gideon throwing out a fleece. Here's the test. In chapter 31, God, if I'm guilty, come down here and do these things to me. You do this. If you stay silent, that's your vindication that I'm innocent. That's. So now the ball's in your court, God. You do what you want to do. Which again, I think is pretty rough. In chapter 31, if you go back to chapter 1, verse 1, chapter 31 is proof that God knew Job better than Job knew Job. And it's proof that Job was who God said he was. This is proof that Job really was a blameless and an upright man who feared God and shunned evil. That's what chapter 31 is. He is saying, God, I trust you so much that even though I can't say I'm wrong, if in your holiness, if you think I'm wrong, then you have a right and an obligation to intervene in my life and issue the punishment that I'm about to dictate to myself. That's what he's about to do. Again, I'd be scared to do this, to be honest with you. but this is what he does. So look at verses 1 through 4. I have made a covenant with my eyes. How then could I gaze at a virgin? And what is the portion of God from above, or the heritage of the Almighty from on high? Is it not calamity to the unjust and disaster to those who work iniquity? Does he not see my way and number all my steps? He's outlining the principles by which he lived. This is how I lived. And there's a couple of ways that he's describing it in these first 4 verses. He's describing that here's the way I live my life in ethical purity. And he does it in a couple of ways. First of all, he said, I made a binding covenant with my eyes. I made a covenant with my eyes. And then he used and here's a good, let me find it. Look at verse 3. And verse 5 actually says it. But verse 3, is it not calamity to the unjust? Look at verse 5, for example. If I have walked with falsehood, the word if is the big word in these ancient Near Eastern covenantal treaties. If then, we call them if then clauses. You ever think about 2 Chronicles chapter 7 verse 14? You know what? They're kind of starting to rebuild the temple or rededicate the temple. And you know what God said? If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and turn from their iniquities and all this stuff, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sins and heal their land. If you do this, then I will do that. This is a if then that Job is imposing on himself. It's covenantal treaty language. Job is saying, I made a covenant with my eyes so that if I do this and violate that covenant, then God has a right to do this. That's what Job is saying. Look at verse 2 and 3. He says, is it not calamity to the unjust, disaster to those who work iniquity? In other words, it is God's absolute right to punish the wicked. That's what he's talking about. God has a right to do that. Now look at verses 5 through 8. In this chapter, Job mentions 14 sins by name. They are not heinous crimes. He's not talking about murdering and those kind of what we call the biggies. He's talking about minor deviations from an ethical standard. Simple stuff. Small things. And so Job is going to list 14 things in this chapter. And he's going to say, this is the principle by which I live my life. I didn't, tell a white lie. I did, just little simple things. Ethical standard. There's an ethical way to live my life that's pleasing to God. And Job says, and he lists 14, these are the things. If I do these things, small little things, just small things, then God has a right to intervene and impose punishment on me. That's what he's talking about. Again, they're not big things. They're actually covert things, not really overt. They're things that nobody else would even see. They're things of the conscience, things of the mind, things of the heart. And Job said, if I do these, even though they're small, then God, you come down and you execute judgment on me, because I would have deserved it. Again, he's setting this real high bar, and let's put it this way: if we were talking to God like this, and we said, "Hey God, I'm gonna make a deal with you. I'm not talking about murder and adultery and all this, although he does mention adultery in here. I'm not talking about all these big things. I'm talking about small little things. That's if we were having this conversation with God, and we said, God, if because we have an ethical standard. They're called the epistles. That's why the epistles are in the Bible. That's the ethical way to live our life. And if we look at those epistles, and if we say, okay, here's the way I'm supposed to live my life, and so let's say we make a deal with God and say, God, let's don't even talk about the big things. Let's talk about those little things. And so, God, I'm going to make a deal with you. If I break just one of those little things, deviate just one little iota, which is a Greek letter. If I deviate just one little bit from one of these little things, then God, you can cast me to hell. That's basically what Job is saying. Job is saying, let's don't talk about the big things. Let's talk about these little things. And if I break one of these little things, then God, I invite you to come down and execute the punishment that I will now tell you what it should be. I'm going to tell you because I don't think I'm guilty, and I'm counting on you to vindicate me. He's taking a big chance. And so then look at verse 9. If my heart's been enticed by a woman, or I've lurked at my neighbor's doorway. He's talking about adultery. He's talking about all these. There's 14 sins that he makes, that he named. And he's talking about the fact that he says, I believe in my heart that I've lived a life of integrity. If you and I made that same deal, I'm not judging you may be a lot better than I am, but how long would you last? I mean, if you say, God, let's say, we joke about this in our neighborhood all the time. In our neighborhood, we live in a little, residential cul-de-sac neighborhood. Nobody ever does anything over there. And somebody complained years ago about speeders, and they put speed bumps in our little neighborhood. And those things were about yay high. It just ripped the whole front of your car off. If you barely do hit them. So somebody complained to the city and said, those things are too crazy. So the city came out and put stop signs up. All right, and they put one right in Daddy's yard by his driveway, so that, no joke, right by Daddy's driveway is a dead end. It's just woods right there. Ain't nobody coming out of there. And so if you back out of Daddy's driveway, there's a stop sign. So you have to stop, right? Back out and stop right there. There's nobody coming, but you have to stop. Now, the law says you got to stop sign, right? So what if a police officer was sitting right down there, and they have been lately, because I guess people's complaining that we're running the stop signs now. And I'll be honest with you, most of the time I do, because I lived over there for 26 years with no stop sign. So Kevin, put your fingers in your ear like this. But I don't necessarily run them. I roll through them. I slow down enough to make sure nobody's coming, and then I go, because I've been driving over there 26 years without the doggone stop sign, and so I don't feel like I need one. So I help myself. Now, what if a police officer is sitting right there, and what if he sees me roll through that stop sign, and if he is bound by the law, if he says, Jeff, I understand, you've been here 26 years, you've never had a stop sign, now we put these stop signs up, but I have to write you a ticket. And I beg and I plead, and I say, please. I mean, nobody was coming. There's not even a road down here for a car to come down. Why in the world do I have to stop right here? But he writes me a ticket anyway, because that's the law. The Gospels are like the Old Testament law. It was not just that you obey the letter of the law, you're to obey the spirit of it also. And so Job is saying to God, if I've ever rolled through that stop sign just one time, then you can come down and punish me, because I don't think I have. That's the kind of risk that he's taking. He's saying, God, I know that I've been righteous. I know that I've been judged, and I don't deserve what I'm going through. So he's saying, God, let's me and you get real here. If I've even deviated a little bit, then I won't argue a bit when you come and punish me. I won't argue. I won't say a word. I won't be mad because I know I will have deserved it. Look at verse 16 in chapter 31. If I have kept the poor from their desire, or have caused the eyes of the widow to fail. Job respected human life very highly. All of his life, he's taken care of the poor and the needy. That's what he's done. He's already told us that. And he says, here's one of those sins that he mentioned. If I've ever taken advantage of a needy person, then you have a right to punish me. I won't argue it because I don't think I've done that. I think all my life I have lived just and taken care of people. Look at verses 24 through 28. He says, I've not taken excessive delight in possessions. He says, I was not an idolater. I wasn't greedy. I didn't manipulate my wealth to start accumulating stuff just so I could have stuff. It's 14 sins that he mentions, and they're tiny little things. They're little. But Job is saying, it would be easy for me and you to say, God, I promise you I've never killed anybody. So based on that, I deserve to go to heaven. That's pretty easy. Most of us have never done that. It would be very difficult for us to say, God, I promise I've never told a white lie. God, I promised I've never taken advantage of somebody, whether intentionally or unintentionally. It's hard for us to say that. And so Job's going to that extreme to really prove it. Because what he's really wanting is God to show up. He really wants to talk to God. And up until this point, God's been silent, and that's really bothering him. Look at verse 19. Verse 19 through 32. Job saying, you can go back and read these. Job said, I never rejoiced when my enemies suffered. I didn't rejoice. He said, I didn't withhold hospitality from strangers. I didn't do any of that. Look at verse 33 and 34. I'm going to read this because I think this gets a lot of Christians. Verse 33, have I covered my transgressions like Adam by hiding my iniquity in my bosom? Because I feared the great multitude, and the contempt of families terrified me, and kept silent, did not go outdoors. Do you know what he's saying? You want me to sum this up? I've never been a hypocrite. I've never covered up my sins. And then he throws poor Adam under the bus. Because when Adam sinned, he tried to hide himself from God. And he said, I've never been like Adam. I've always done right. I've never been a hypocrite. How many Christians, or what percentage of Christians, living in the world throughout history can say definitively 100%, I've never been a hypocrite by trying to cover up something I did wrong? I mean, yeah. I don't think if anybody says that they fit that, then they're telling one. Nobody that's ever lived. Well, I shouldn't be so all inclusive, but I can almost guarantee that nobody that's ever lived has never tried to cover up something. And Job said, I haven't done that. I haven't been a hypocrite like Adam. I hadn't tried to cover my sins. Look at verse 35. Oh, that I had one to hear me. Behold, here is my signature. Let the Almighty answer me in the indictment which my adversary has written. Job cries for a hearer of his claim, somebody to hear his claim. Now, here's where it gets a little bit different, because you remember we've been talking about all this time. Job has been saying, God, you are so holy, and I'm way down here. And Job has been saying, even if you came down to hear me, and I presented my case, you probably wouldn't understand anyway. You probably wouldn't side with me, because you already have your mind made up because you're a holy God. So remember, Job's been saying, I need a referee. I need an advocate. I need somebody to stand in the gap for me to intercede. It's not what he's saying right here. The language right here, he's calling now ultimately for God to come down. He said, I don't want a referee, I don't want a mediator, I want to talk to you. I want this between me and you. That's what he's asking. I want you to come down. I don't want a mediator. I know I requested one. Forget that. I don't want to do that. I now want to talk to you. And then in verse 38 through 40, he gives a final defense of this, a final summation, and he rests his case. Look at verse 38. If my land cries out against me, and if its furrows weep together, if I have eaten its fruit without money, or have caused its owners to lose their lives, let briars grow instead of wheat, and stinkweed instead of barley. The words of Job are ended. That's how he finished. He said, okay, God, I don't have anything else to say. Now, you come and let's talk. Now, God is going to show up eventually. And we'll get to that in chapter 38. In the meantime, Elihu is standing by, and now he's fixing to jump in. But he's just like the other ones. He's no help. He's no comfort. And he's going to give kind of 4 back-to-back speeches criticizing Job. And Job responds again. But Job's done with his friends. He doesn't want to hear it. Job's waiting on God now, because Job realizes that's the only way he's going to get any vindication, any answer, any help, is if he talks directly to God, which is exactly the shape that you and I are in. We cannot rely on anybody else. It's ultimately we have to talk to God. We have to come clean with Him. We have to admit. And you know, it's like I told the kids in Vacation Bible School, it's ABCs. You know, you admit you're a sinner, believe in who Jesus is, confess that's all that matters. You and I have got to come to the point where we are brave enough and adult enough to say, God, I have a sin in my life. I'm not right, and I need your help. And God is forever gracious enough to work things out with us. He's not just going to throw us to the side. So that's the end of Job's soliloquy. Now, next week we'll look at Elihu's speeches, at least a couple of them. There's no way we can get through all 4 of his speeches in one night. We might do 2 and then 2, and then in 3 weeks we'll look at God and Job's begin their conversation. Any questions about those 4 chapters?